Well, blessed Wednesday to you as we come with your daily encouragement. And we have the ministry of proclamation is what falls the ministry of bearing. But to transition, Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, then where the ministry of listening, active helpfulness, and bearing, those have been the three that we've talked about, with others are faithfully performed, the ultimate and highest service can also be rendered, namely, in the ministry of the Word of God. In other words, if we want to define what it means to proclaim, we need to be bearing people, we need to be actively helpful people, and we also need to be actively listening people. And so he goes into what we are concerned about here is the free communication of the Word, meaning the Word, the Bible, the interpersonal relationship of the Word Jesus Christ from person to person, not by the ordained ministry, which is bound to a particular office, time, and place, or pastor. We are thinking of the unique situation in which one person bears witness to the human words to another person, bespeaking the whole consolation of God, the admonition, the kindness, and the severity of God. The speaking of that word is beset with infinite perils. It is not accompanied by worthy listening. How can it really be right for the word for the other person? If it is contradicted by one's lack of own active healthfulness, how can it be convincing and sincere word? If it issues not from a spirit of bearing and forbearing, but from an impatience and a desire to force its acceptance, how can it be liberating and healing? In other words, we got to make sure that our active uh, words are also, should I say, our active response to that word. In other words, make sure you put your money where your mouth is. I think it's almost on the lines of what James talks about in his letter in the Bible, where Paul talks about freedom. We have a freedom because we have been set free by the gospel. And that is good and that is right, but we also have to be bound with each other in love. And so it is both faith and love, faith and works that have to go hand in hand. And so the same thing is concerning Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And what he's concerned about is when our active listening doesn't exist, our active bearing doesn't exist, our active putting our money where our mouth is doesn't exist, it hinders the ministry of the word, of the gospel, of the good news throughout the world. And we don't have to go very far for that, but let's look at it even historically. We have seen and heard about how evangelism took place 100, 200 years ago. It was accompanied by what I would call arrogance. It was accompanied by an idea that we had to acculturate as much as we had to evangelize the good news. There was not a desire to make a necessarily indigenous people. There was a desire to make a Western people along with the evangelism of the good news. Now, in some parts of the world, I would say even in Asia where Christianity is exploding, in Africa where Christianity is exploding, there have been some tendencies where the Christianity there has taken on African, if not Asian, characteristics, and sometimes to its detriment, and sometimes others have critiqued and said, this is what happens when you don't do culture and evangelism. No, I would say this is what has happened with Western culture, where it has some Christian aspects to it, but it also has taken on some things that are far from Christian. And so it is the balance that we have to do when you are starting to bring in the good medicine to the world. There will also be times where you have things that are mixed, things that are a little bit of good and a lot of bad, or a little bit of good and a little bit of bad. Things are gradually starting to take its effect. And so it is a warning to us that we have been entrusted with this word. And Paul talks about it in Second Corinthians, where he says that our word has been put into clay pots. And usually when you talk about clay pots is there's a tendency that they're used for ordinary use. They sometimes break, but they are still useful for their time and for their place. And so it is with our relationships. And that's why he contrasts it so much from the formal relationship of being a pastor or a bishop or a deacon. Those are formal relationships. And yes, even in formal relationships, they can take sideways turns. But he's talking about our everyday relationships as Christians, our full witness as believers, and I would say even as a pastor. I have my formal Christian relationships to my office, but I also have my prior relationships with friends and family. And they are always and continue to be, even as I practice this pastoral office, informal and kind of messy sometimes. But they also have the longest lasting connection with each other because they have a bond that goes beyond just a time and a place. And should I say, even, I'm not even talking about a paycheck, but just a formal relationship. That's what I have as a pastor. I have a very formalized relationship, even with other body, my denomination, kind of overseeing to making sure that all those things have checks and balances. But many of us have more intimate, more messy, how should I say, more organic relationships with our family, our friends, and others. And those will not be ones that start because we have been ordained to an office. They start because we have been born into a community. And that is the ones that he's talking about. That we have to make sure that our full witness is a witness towards the word and not just one that contradicts what the word says. And that's where I think his challenge to us is very direct. Examine yourself. Are you forgiving in all your relationships? Are you bearing in all your relationships? Are you actively listening in all of your relationships? Because if we are not in those three areas, we ruin the witness of God. And so it is like the season of Lent, an examination. How are you doing in those areas? How are we putting those things together? And that's one of the questions that I'd have for you. How are you doing in your global witness? Are you showing your sin before you're showing your sainthood? Now, we're going to have probably a little bit of both, and we as a community will bear each other's burdens in our in between saint and sinner. But the question is, what do you take priority? My right to my freedom to be who I am, or my right to be a believer who bears one another's burdens on the cross? Take care. God bless. We'll hope that these continue to be words of encouragement. We'll see you tomorrow.